At nightfall, we marched near Kalanchak, using the factor of surprise, attacked the town and took it. Enveloped in flames, the enemy armored vehicle exploded. 221 Russian soldiers joined the ranks of prisoners of war. Reconnaissance teams reported that the area 10 kilometers east of Kalanchak is free of the enemy. At midnight, I received orders from the infantry division to break through the Perikop Isthmus in a surprise attack and await further orders on the approach to Ishun. In the course of various campaigns, I had often received orders and assignments that had nothing in common with the basics of classical military leadership. But this order surpassed them all. Did my responsible superiors really think that a sudden strike on the Perikop Isthmus could open the gateway to the Crimea? My company commanders looked at me in some amazement when I gave them this order and briefed them on the situation. Crimea is separated from the mainland by the Gulf of Sivash, or, as it is also called, the Rotten Sea. This so-called sea is a system of small bays with highly mineralized water and almost impassable. Because of the shallow water, it was an insurmountable obstacle even for assault boats. The Perikop Isthmus in the west, the railroad crossing over the Chongar Peninsula in the center, and the narrow strait near Genechesk leading to the Arabatskaya Arrow in the east. Perikop Isthmus, 8 kilometers wide in the narrowest place, is dug by the ancient Tata ditch up to 15 meters deep. The terrain here is flat as a pancake and crossed by several gullies, dry or with a temporary watercourse valleys. They served as the battalion's only shelter. Right at the northern side of the Taita moat was the old fortified town of Perikop. The railroad ran through the Perikop Isthmus to the Crimea. In view of such favorable opportunities for defense, and the fact that in the last few days we had taken prisoners from 3 different enemy divisions, no one believed that the isthmus would not be a difficult obstacle. On September 12 at about 30 a.m., my battalion moved toward Perikop. We made contact with the advance battalion of the 73rd Infantry Division under Major Stifter at 4.5 UAM Stifter, joined my battalion. The distant horizon slowly grew out of the twilight of dawn. The steppe glistened with the most marvelous colors. Not a single living human being could be seen. Only my soldiers were moving forward, leaping like frogs. SS Sturmführer Montag led the front platoon. SS Untersturmführer Westphal was in the lead patrol. I followed, looking nervously at the horizon, trying to see signs of any movement. But there were no people or animals in sight. Only the play of colors from the rising sun gave the plain an amazing, dreamlike appearance. I sent Butner's platoon far ahead to scout the terrain along the coast of the Perikop Gulf near the Second Alexandrovka. From there, the terrain to the north and south of the Tata moat was to be clearly visible. Suddenly, I noticed several horsemen on the horizon, which circled in place and then disappeared in the direction of the village of Preobrashenka. Their fleeting appearance roused us. Preobrashenka was behind a small rise, and only a few houses were visible. Strongly alarmed, we gazed at the horizon as we continued driving. We drove on, increasing the distance between the cars. We had a feeling that the peace could be broken at any moment by the howling shells and mines of large-caliber mortars. The Soviets had to take advantage of these convenient defensive positions. A ghostly calm foreshadowed the battle. There were no fleeing Russians, no frantically galloping cavalry units, no roar vehicle engines. Nothing indicated flight or even retreat. The steppe was empty. Not a soul could be seen anywhere. This fact alone pointed to tight management and strict control by the enemy commanders. My soldiers were once again hanging off the sides of their vehicles. Even the motorcyclists of the lead platoon sat askew on their vehicles. I stood on the footplate of a rushing armored vehicle, following in the center of our battle order. My watch showed 6.5 as the Westphalian squad slowly approached the houses of Preobrashenka. A huge herd of sheep blocked the entrance to the village. It was moving off into the steppe. Suddenly the silence was broken by an explosion, followed by another, a third. The sheep were tossed in the air. The maddened animals rushed, looking for escape, jumping on each other to get out, but they flew up into the air. Turning sideways, the sheep fell into a minefield. The pitiful bleating of the dying animals filled the air. It mingled with the deafening sound of exploding anti-tank mines. Huddled on the ground, ready to rush and trembling with excitement, we waited for the bright flashes of gunfire from the Soviet troops. We ran alongside the vehicles, intending to enter the settlement and gain a foothold there. However, still not a shot was fired. Only the mines were completing their deadly work. All that remained of the great flock of sheep was a twitching, bloody mass, and a couple of animals with difficulty escaped. But then it happened. The long-awaited voice of the front sounded. Russian shells whistled over us and exploded in Stifter's marching column. His soldiers ran back, first one at a time, and then in large masses. I rushed forward, anxious to reach the first houses of the village, whence Perikop should be visible. After several jumps, I dived into the road dust under a hail of shrapnel from the bursting shells. The dark monster had advanced on a slight rise and was firing directly at us. Just a few hundred meters ahead of us was a fire-breathing dragon, sowing death and devastation in our ranks. In the path of the battalion, bristling with gun muzzles, stood an armoured train. I gave the signal to withdraw. My motorcyclist turned on the spot and rushed back in a broad front, while the armoured cars fired at the train and withdrew, covered by a smoke screen. A 37 anti-tank gun fired shells at the armoured train, and a few seconds later it itself went off. The clang and rumble of the crushed steel carriage drowned out the screams of my dying soldiers. 5 batteries of heavy and 2 of light guns were firing at us. Behind us, we could see only columns of dust. I breathed a sigh of relief. There were no burning tanks or armoured vehicles in sight. I crawled forward a few more steps and could distinguish deeply echeloned field fortifications with a strip of barbed wire and ditches. The armoured train, puffing, moved away in the direction of Perikop. I could see the Russian infantrymen in their trenches only 50 meters away from us, their pounding machine guns forcing us to huddle on the ground. We had to get rid of them or face the road to capture. Now it was the turn of our shells, flying whistling over us, to force the Russians to seek cover, though we ourselves had to press into every fold of the terrain. Around me lay wounded soldiers. Ses Unterscharführer SS Westphal had his arm torn off. SE Rottenführer SS Stoll was a few meters away from me. He was moaning in pain. Helmut Belkay was not wounded. Stoll's sidecar motorcycle was still in order. Its motor was running amid the clatter of machine gun fire. Belkay shouted something to Stoll, pointed to the motorcycle, and began to make his way towards Stoll. He bent over SS Unterscharführer. All efforts were in vain. Shrapnel had torn his back. As he gulped for air, I could see his lungs shaking. The roar of the engine proclaimed Stoll's rescue. Belk drove the wounded soldiers to safety, ignoring Russian fire. He made 3 rides, risking his life for his comrades. 3 times he returned for a load of groaning wounded. Another of our comrades was still lying in the steppe grass. Like us, he was in the dead zone behind a small rise. Soldier G was a reservist, married, a happy father of 2 small sons. He crawled into a shallow depression, his mop of blonde hair splattered with blood. The words came from his lips with a groan. "Get out of here. It's no use. I'm finished." I tried to calm him down, but in vain. Several motorcycles roared up behind the remnants of the advance party. I couldn't take my eyes off G. His hand clutched the handle of his pistol. He slowly raised the weapon, pulled the trigger, twitched his whole body and fell silent. The horrified motorcyclists threw him onto one of the bikes. We were lucky. We all made it to the battalion positions despite the fire of Russian artillery and infantry. With a tremor in my voice, I told Dr. uttering what had happened to our battle comrade G, and only then learned that he suffered and shot himself, having lost his manhood in that battle, torn off by a shell fragment. Ruhl died while the doctors were fighting to save him. What was in their power was not enough. Having retreated, we, together with Stifter's detachment, took up a position 4 kilometers west of Preobrazhenka, where we awaited the approach of the 73rd Infantry Division. At 6:50, Butner's platoon reported that the western shore of Perikop Bay was free of the enemy. From there, the terrain south of Perikop, including the Tatar Ditch, was clearly visible. Von Buter reported strong field fortifications, barbed wire fences, guns and tanks buried in the ground. Half an hour later, I was convinced of the accuracy of his report. The attack on the isthmus could be realized only by a strike of several divisions supported by heavy artillery. Therefore, I was thunderstruck when in the middle of the day I received the order to continue the offensive on the isthmus. I refused to lead my comrades to certain death, referring to my first report and to the unusually strong fortifications in the offensive strip. The division told me to report personally to the divisional commander. After several hours of travel, I arrived at the command post in a small village northeast of Kalanchak. I expected a big blow for my refusal to carry out the order, and was surprised when General Beeler greeted me in a very friendly manner and agreed with my assessment of the situation. In the evening, I briefed Colonel Hitzfeld on the situation in the area of our battalion, and then led the battalion to Chaplinka, where new directives awaited us. We were leaving the front, pursued by enemy dive bombers and accompanied by enemy artillery. In Chaplinka, I received an order from Sepp Dietrich to advance eastward to the central part of the isthmus of the Chonga Peninsula near Salkova, and, if possible, to take it by surprise attack. Meanwhile, it was already 16.0, and we had to carry out the operation in the advancing night. When I arrived at the battalion, my young soldiers were already seated on their vehicles, and in 5 minutes we moved east north of Sivash, deepening into the dimly glistening steppe. At 17:50 we passed Vladimirovka, where we came under fire from the Crimean Peninsula Rhinos, a battery of 122 guns trying to stop our advance. We proceeded east without loss. I wanted, while it was light and not dark, to cover as much distance as possible. We spent the night at Gromovka without making contact with the enemy. At 30 on September 15, the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion stood ready to move in the vanguard. From the hot coffee in the hands of my soldiers came steam, and I, together with SS Obersturmführer Speth, weighed the situation and assessed the latest intelligence data and testimony of prisoners. Air and ground reconnaissance reported well-equipped field fortifications, which stretched in a semicircle around the railroad junction Solkov. A breakthrough through the fortifications seemed impossible. We had neither the necessary forces nor the appropriate weapons at our disposal. In addition, aerial photographs of reconnaissance planes south of Solkov showed guns on reinforced concrete firing positions that dominated the narrow isthmus. A thick fog lay over the steppe and visibility was less than 20 meters. The latter factor led me to the idea of using the fog to appear right under the nose of the enemy battery and break through to the defense line at Solkov. I was sure that the fortifications closest to the coast were weaker, and it would not occur to anyone that a motorcycle unit could be so abnormal as to storm a system of defensive fortifications 200 or 300 meters in front of the barrels of artillery batteries. The fog would hold for at least another hour. During this time, it was necessary at all costs to seize the disengagement. I quickly explained my intention to the vanguard company and shook hands with SS Obersturmführer Speth. Speth moved in the lead platoon. SS Obersturmführer SS Normann's 88 mm guns, including the one pulled from the Dnieper, joined the marching column and followed the advance company. They were to fire on the pillboxes south of the disengagement. Motorcycles, armoured vehicles, tractors, and guns slowly rolled into an impenetrable wall of fog. In a matter of seconds, the grey nothingness swallowed them up. Peter was cursing loudly as he started our armoured vehicle and steered it into the fog. My adjutant, a small but wiry SS Obersturmführer Weiser, looked out to the right, trying to see the shore of the Sivash. It was important that we move closer to the shore of the Rotten Sea. Although we were at most 50 meters from the shore, we could not see it. After 20 minutes, we came across a road fork from which several roads diverged in all directions. A soldier approached us out of the fog, and we thought it was Spat who had left a guide behind him so that we would not lose our way. I called out to the man, asking where we should go from here. Only then did we determine that we had passed 150 meters south of the Russian post. We got closer and closer to the roadblock. Soon we could distinguish a paved road. The fog was clearing. It was time to act. Would military luck favor us, or would we have to pay a high price for our insolence? We gazed silently into the wall of fog. To our right, the water splashed by a low shore. A few kilometers to the south, beyond the Sivash, the dark Crimean coast looked out of the fog. But what was on our shore? Where was the enemy? Step by step, we continued to move eastward. The tracks of the tractors were bogged down in the sand. Their engines were barely audible. There was a tremendous tension in everything. I pointed south and drew the attention of the 88 mm gun crews to the reported pillboxes and field fortifications. All was quiet so far. Were we marching toward death again? Would a surprise attack like the one at Preobrazhenka be repeated? A deafening rumble broke the morning silence. Suddenly the peace was broken. As soon as fire was opened, we recognized the sharp crackle of shots from one of our 37 BM anti-tank guns. Simultaneously, we heard the barking sounds of our 20mm automatic cannon and the angry boom of German machine guns. The second company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion reached the isthmus at Salkov and stopped a supply train carrying weapons and military equipment. A 37mm cannon hit the locomotive. We cut into the defense system more successfully than we thought, and in fact were able to attack the Russian positions from the rear. At 8:55, the railroad junction was completely in our hands. We captured the command post of the Russian defense and broke their lines of communication. The confusion of the Russians was indescribable. They simply did not believe that we could be here. The Russian artillery from positions south of the gap only opened fire when our 88 mm guns began hitting the Russian pillboxes. The fog had cleared and no longer concealed our own or the enemy. Bremer advanced northward and broke through to the outskirts of Novomeksivka. SS Obersturmführer Norman drove the 88mm gun to a position from which he was able to hit several Russian guns. Thanks to the decisive actions of the calculation, the task of neutralizing the Russian guns was solved. Unfortunately, in the course of its solution, Dr. Norman was seriously wounded. He was taken by armored car to safety. We completely destroyed the ring of defenses north of the isthmus. However, it was impossible to advance further south and cross it. Stots and bunkers with thick barbed wire barriers and minefields required heavy artillery and infantry units. The battalion managed to capture several hundred men who belonged to the 871st and 876th Rifle Regiments. The isthmus leading to the Chongar Peninsula was defended by the 276th Infantry Division. We captured 86 new trucks, 26 tracked tractors, 2 45 mm anti-tank guns, and several ammunition cars with a load of 122mm caliber shells from supply trains that arrived from Melitopol. The ammunition was supposed to be delivered to Sevastopol. We were glad we had captured the train. We were soon outfitted with new Russian Ford trucks. Our own inventory of automobiles was greatly reduced. There was a shortage of motorcycles. I was relieved to learn a few hours later that we had lost only one soldier. He had been killed by shrapnel. Our success made possible an unconventional way of fighting. During the night we were replaced by the 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry Regiment, Leibstander Division. The vehicles were refueled and tested at full speed for the next operation. We were given a new task, to immediately take Genichesk and block the road through the 3rd Spit. By 5.0, we were again sitting in our cars, moving towards the sun. After a short time, we saw the Sea of Azov for the first time. Its smooth surface spread out in front of us like a mirror. One large steamer and 5 smaller ones were moving eastward and soon disappeared over the horizon. We reached Genichesk at about 6:30. The outskirts of the town were quiet. Not a soul was to be seen. Was this silence part of the Russian defensive tactics, or was this port town simply unprotected? The motorcycle squad cautiously approached the houses, but, contrary to expectations, met no resistance. Then we rushed forward at full speed, going deeper into the eastern part of the city and the harbour area. The situation there was different. A column of trucks tried to escape in the direction of Melitopol. The enemy infantry fled in panic to the nearest houses and after a while surrendered. An explosion in the harbour announced the explosion of the bridge connecting Genichesk with the Crimean Peninsula. The 2nd Company of the 1st SE's Reconnaissance Battalion quickly seized the footbridge across the narrow strait connecting the Sifash with the Sea of Arves and saved it from being blown up. During the attack on the bridge, a bullet to the head killed the company commander, SO Obersturmführer Speth. Losses in the officer ranks resulted in a dangerous disproportion. Almost all former company commanders and platoon commanders were killed or wounded. The 2nd Company of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion already had a 3rd commander, SO Obersturmführer Becher. From the steep bank at Genichesk, we had a far view to the south, and through the strait we could observe all enemy movements. Accordingly, it was no surprise to us when the Soviet troops attacked us from the direction of the Arabatskaya Arrow, appearing before us like targets on a firing range. Company after company slowly but steadily moved toward our steep elevation to certain death or capture. It was a mystery to me why the Soviet commander was conducting this attack. Before our machine guns gathered their bloody harvest, we let the enemy infantry come up about 200 meters. The result was horrific. In a matter of minutes, countless bodies of dead Red Army soldiers covered the sparse grassy terrain, while the survivors staggered toward our positions with their arms raised. The Russian mortar positions were covered by the fire of our 88 mm anti-aircraft guns. By 9.0 the attack was repulsed, and the 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion marched across the footbridge to the Arabatskaya Strelka to reconnoitre in a southerly direction. I intended to establish a bridgehead and advance along this narrow strip of land as far as possible. Unfortunately, the reconnaissance stalled after only 3 kilometers. Field fortifications and shore batteries mounted on concrete structures formed an insurmountable obstacle, and open fire from them, together with several attacks by Russian bombers, resulted in some personnel casualties during the night. On September 17 at about 21.0, our battalion was replaced by the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Motorized Infantry Regiment of the SS Leibstander Division. We, on the other hand, were tasked to reconnoitre in a northeastern direction and try to link up with the Vanguard Battalion Bodin XX Army Corps. During the night, our battalion received 6 officers and 95 soldiers as replenishment. The replenishment, the first since the beginning of the war in Russia, made an excellent impression and quickly became part of the battalion. In a matter of days, the young soldiers became veteran warriors. Under the usual annoying air raid, we left Genichesk and moved towards Melitopol. We experienced the full brunt of the journey northeast over settled, sandy roads, through wooded areas, and soon came into contact with von Bodin's battalion stationed south of Akimovka, which was occupied by large Russian forces. Von Bodin and I had many mutual acquaintances in Mecklenburg, in which we had both spent some memorable years. A typical cavalryman, von Bodin changed uniforms in the early 30s and worked with General von Seeckt in China until he was recalled to service in the German army. He was an impetuous, almost hot-tempered officer, unafraid to take risks and decisive in attack. He died in January 1942 in battle near Evipatoria in the Crimea. He was killed by treacherous partisans. 2 vanguard battalions fought on the southern outskirts of Melitopol until September 21, waiting for the approach of the 72nd Infantry Division. Further attack on Melitopol and north of the city without the support of large infantry forces was impossible. We broke away from the rest of the forces of the XXX Army Corps by 200 kilometers. On September 21, I received the order to withdraw from the battle and lead the battalion back to Kalanchak. The unit withdrew almost 200 kilometers for 12 hours, and on September 22 was ready for the upcoming assault on the Crimean Peninsula. During the long march through the Nogai steppes of northern Tavria, I first felt the terrible emptiness of open spaces. We moved westward for hours without meeting a single German soldier. Left to themselves, the rapidly advancing vanguard battalions rushed deep into Russian territory and pushed forward far to the east. but German troops did not take possession of the region. The unfolding emptiness of the steppe had a depressing effect on us. How will we conduct further operations in the east? What units and formations will be thrown against the enemy forces in the Crimea? We began to look beyond the immediate concrete battle and to guess the operational task of the army in the east. No one believed any longer that the formations at hand were sufficient to hold the front during the winter months. German units and formations were shattered and urgently needed rest, replenishment, and repair. We were attached to the Liv Army Corps, and after the brave 73rd Infantry Division had managed to storm Perikop and overcome the Tata Ditch on September 26, we had to quickly cross the isthmus and cut into the retreating enemy lines. The battalion stood ready to conduct the operation by the end of the day, 4 kilometers northwest of Perikop Bay. A battle of extraordinary intensity and ferocity on both sides ensued, and it was not until September 27 that the battalion of the 72nd Infantry Regiment was able to break into Armyansk. However, even on September 28, there were no conditions for the use of motorized units. The Soviets counterattacked again and again with large forces supported by tanks. At 4:30, the battalion was attached to the 46th Infantry Division and moved into position 3 kilometers northwest of Perikop. Positioned north of the Tatar Ditch, our battalion was withdrawn at 9.0. As there was no possibility of fighting in the 46th Infantry Division's operational area, the battalion returned to the Leibstandarte at 11.0.
Soviet defensive positions on the isthmus south of Perikop were crushed only after 10 days of heavy fighting. It was not possible to break through the isthmus until September 28 TE, indeed after 10 days of heavy fighting, said I. After that, the road to the Crimea was open. On September 29, the pursuit of the defeated Soviet troops began, culminating in the final assault on Sevastopol on June 29–July 4, 1942, while the Liv Army Corps fought hard for every inch of ground south of Perikop, and the main army command planned to send the Leibstandarte to pursue the enemy after the successful breakthrough Il. On the eastern front between the Sea of Azov, Melitopol and the Dnieper River, events occurred that required the immediate transfer of the division.
The Russians strengthened the front line here, and following the arrival of 2 new armies. The 18th and 9th launched an attack on the positions of the XX Army Corps and the 3rd Romanian Army, with a total of 12 divisions. Their attack on the positions of the XX Army Corps was smothered by the stubborn resistance of the German troops, but to the north, on the section of the 3rd Romanian Army, the 4th Romanian Mountain Brigade was crushed. 2 other mountain brigades suffered heavy losses, and a 15-kilometer gap in the front of the army was breached. Because of this change in the situation on September 29, we were pushed back to the north, and we, together with our other units, were assigned the task of attacking and destroying the enemy in the area where he broke through the Romanian defense line, in cooperation with units of the 49th German Mountain Corps. The gap in the defense of the 3rd Romanian Army was eliminated, and the Soviet troops suffered heavy losses. Undoubtedly, the sudden appearance of 2 new Russian armies near Melitopol forced the German High Command to endure many hours of fear, but because of the way the Russians conducted the operation, they provided Army Group South with a unique opportunity. Due to massive, costly attacks aimed at disrupting the German offensive in the Crimea, the Russians did not have enough reserves to prevent the breakthrough of von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group from the Dnieper bridgeheads. On October 1, the 1st Tank Group von Kleist began an offensive to the southeast, threatening to interrupt the lines of communication of both Russian armies and together with the XX Army Corps and the 3rd Romanian Army to destroy them. The pursuit of the retreating Russian troops north of the Sea of Azov began. From October 2 to 4, Von Bodin's battalion, the fighter anti-tank battalion of the 72nd Infantry Division, and our battalion fought together against large enemy forces in the area of Elizavetovka northwest of Berdyansk. The Soviet troops suffered heavy losses in these battles. Time after time they turned to flee before our better weapons and more mobile battalions, and in doing so suffered heavy losses. The steppe naturally gave our vanguard battalions a huge advantage and put the enemy infantry, which had a significant numerical superiority, at a disadvantage. On October 5, our infantry divisions attacked deeply echeloned positions between Melitopol and the Dnieper. A deep anti-tank ditch stretched all along the attack sector and was stubbornly defended by Soviet troops. Minefields and wire fences hindered our advance. Our battalion was assigned the task of capturing the Molotnaya River crossing and holding the bridge, ensuring the infantry's advance across it. Again, we followed the attacking infantry battalion and waited for the signal to begin the operation. Our brave infantry had to fight their way through many minefields. The Russian anti-tank mines were encased in wood and could not be detected by mine detectors. There were also anti-tank mines in wooden casings. Around noon, the German infantry did overcome the anti-tank ditch, breaking through the main strip of Russian defences. A crossing was immediately created across the ditch to bring my battalion into the break. In anxious anticipation, Grimmir's 1st Company, 1st SA Reconnaissance Battalion, positioned itself at the head of the column behind my armoured vehicle. The Soviet troops were retreating. We could see individual batteries retreating to rear position. It was our time. We had to cut into the retreating enemy orders and seize the bridgehead behind the bridge over the Molotnaya River. The hunt was on. Full of enthusiasm, the front platoon rushed forward like a greyhound let off the leash. Bremer and I followed him in a cloud of rising dust. Only the occasional mortar shell interfered with our advance. The battalion advanced through the orders of the retreating enemy, and at 12:30 followed through Fedorovka, where the first batteries of guns and several hundred prisoners were captured. We saw the Russians retreating over the whole foreseeable space. The whole front came into motion. A direct hit by a shell hit our lead armoured vehicle. Motorcyclists eliminated an enemy anti-tank gun fired from a cornfield. The tractor of our anti-tank gun moving ahead of us ran into a mine. The pace of the pursuit accelerated. We were walking like on thin ice, for the retreating Soviet troops always made extensive use of their effective mines. In front of us was the village of Turbulent, which was cut from north to south by the Molotnaya River. The terrain to the east was sinking. Thousands of Soviet cavalrymen were rushing frantically on their horses parallel to us, trying to get to the crossing before we did. They rushed toward the river in a broad front. We reached the first houses of the village of Turbulent. The road went sharply downward and urged us to quicken our pace. In search of shelter, the distraught Soviet soldiers scrambled into the houses. At a bend in the road, guns, vehicles, and wildly tearing horses huddled together in a disorderly heap. Machine gun fire was opened. I looked back at the bridge. Several Russian columns were piled up on the riverbank, trying to find escape on the other bank by wading across. 20 shells fired from armoured vehicles whistled over this chaos and stained the river water red. With cues from automatic guns, we whipped the Soviet soldiers like a whip. Our advance platoon approached the bridge, firing on both sides of it. An incomparable turmoil arose. A dense stream of fleeing men jammed the bridge. To the left and right of the crossing, people and horses were fighting for their lives. Only some 50 meters separated us from the bridge. But the crowd and the hustle and bustle soon came to a cruel end. As soon as the advance platoon cut down to the road to the bridge, firing from a 20mm cannon that formed a bloody trail in the living mass. I saw men, horses and vehicles thrown high into the air. For a moment, together with the girders of the bridge, they hovered in a mushroom cloud of explosion and then disappeared in the muddy slurry of the river. The enemy had blown up the bridge without regard for his own losses. I stood at the site of the explosion with the bitter taste of burned gunpowder in my mouth, desperately searching for a way across the river to prevent the retreating Soviet troops from rejoining. Although we were firing primarily on terrain on the far side of the river, we spotted a small range of hills 3 kilometers away where the Russians were setting up defensive positions. We had to break through them. We could not allow the front to stabilize. A few meters to the right of the bridge we found a ford. The motorcyclists of the 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion had already reached the opposite bank and seized a small bridgehead. An explosion shook our armoured vehicle. Engulfed in flames, it went up in smoke. The armoured vehicle on the approach to the ford ran into an anti-tank mine. Only then did we notice that the Russians had mined the area around the bank and a number of Soviet soldiers had fallen victim to their own mines. I warned Bremer about the mines and instructed him to neutralize them before the rest of the troops crossed the river. Bremer, who was standing a few meters ahead of me, suddenly began gesticulating, excitedly pointing at my feet and shouting, "Look over there, there you are standing on one of the—" He was right. I was standing on one of those infernal devices and at any moment could detonate an explosive device with a slight shift of body weight. We tried to get away from this inhospitable place as soon as possible. By 3 p.m., it was already possible to lead the whole battalion over a temporary bridge across the Moloknaya River. On its eastern bank, we managed to create a bridgehead of 3 kilometers along the front. We were joined by Witt's battalion. The pursuit was to continue from early morning. I was relieved to learn that our losses amounted to only 4 soldiers killed, and of the wounded only 1 died of wounds. The Soviet troops had suffered huge losses in manpower and equipment. The prisoners could hardly be counted. During the night, the battalion's location was subjected to harassing fire, the nature of which indicated a continued Soviet withdrawal. On the basis of the testimony of the prisoners, the course of the fighting all this time, and the front reconnaissance data for the night, I concluded that the Russians were retreating. The onslaught of von Kleist's 1st Tank Group, which from the Dnipropetrovsk bridgehead was advancing in a southeastern direction, was obviously taken into account by the Russian command. While it was still night, I pulled back the combat guard posts and prepared the battalion for daylight. My soldiers knew that we were going to cut deeply into the retreating enemy's fighting order and might have to depend on our own resources for days on end. Attacks and counterattacks would succeed each other, probably including brutal and ruthless stabs in the back. We wanted to confuse the Soviets, upset their plans, and deal them a fatal blow. As dawn broke, I looked at my sleeping soldiers, huddled and curled up by their motorcycles, guns, and tanks, which, along with their cloak tents, protected them from the night's cold, as always. When I was faced with the need to make a decision and the life and death of my soldiers were in my hands, my whole body trembled and I smoked cigarette after cigarette. The time before the first exchange of shots, the first combat contact with the enemy, always pressed on me as the heaviest weight. But when the combat encounter had already taken place and I was standing in the middle of the fight, this pressure seemed to fade away. The soldiers of the engineer sapper units moved forward. Their strong backs bent under the weight of the explosives. A few hundred meters in front of us was a crossing over the anti-tank ditch. During the night it was blown up. We had to collapse the walls of the ditch into the ditch itself to level the steep edges and use the masses of crumbled earth to build the crossing. Motorcyclists were nearby to immediately rush across the ditch. Our mortars and artillery were also ready to fire. The hands of my watch moved inexorably forward, and once again night fell, swallowing up the light of day. Green thickets and trees loomed out of the darkness. A few sporadic Russian shots rang out on our bridgehead. The rooster crowed his morning greeting. Morning came. I walked to my armoured car, making big steps with unbending legs, and climbed on it. From here I could see the thickets far beyond the anti-tank ditch, and our sappers advancing. The armoured cars had silenced several enemy machine guns. A weak enemy barrier was knocked down. With this we secured the crossing of the ditch. As expected, the Russians withdrew during the night, so obviously we would not meet their large forces, at least for the next 2 or 3 hours. The 2nd Company of the 1st SA Reconnaissance Battalion, 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, was leading the way that day. I was somewhat uneasy after the company had a new commander who had previously taught tactics at the Junkers School in Braunschweig and was skeptical of my unconventional methods of combat. I had another heart-to-heart talk with SS Hauptsturmführer and told him not to stop without my orders. He was to move forward at the highest possible speed in the designated direction. I moved with the advance company. After a short battle near the village of Shiroki, the enemy rearguard was crushed, and at 8:45 we reached Astrakanka. The Russian prisoners captured by that time belonged to the 35th, 71st and 256th Rifle Regiments. The regiments were hastily retreating in a southeastern direction. We entered the 30th Division's offensive strip. An interesting, truly impressive picture appeared before us. As far as the eye could sweep, Russian units were running, driving and galloping eastward. An artillery unit with horse-drawn guns was coming down the slope. The guns were dangling in different directions. It was trying to get into a firing position to meet us properly and disrupt our onward movement. Russian mortars were hitting us, mines from which lay already dangerously close to our battalion. But the Soviet retreat turned into a disorderly rout when the commanders already had a poor grasp of the situation. It would be pointless to get into a firefight with the Russian rearguard and lose precious time. I gave SS Hauptsturmführer L the order to continue the offensive without slowing down and not to worry about the threat to our flank. My order and the corresponding signals to my young soldiers added fuel to the fire. The motorcyclists descended on the Soviet troops like a tropical storm, and with their machine gun fire split the mass of fleeing men in two. Heavy armoured vehicles were behind the flanks of the motorcyclists, providing cover. The assault guns sent shells at distant targets. Enemy ammunition trucks rumbled to life, and artillery batteries formed a haphazard cluster of horses, crews, and guns. In the background, 2 old Soviet airplanes flew over the broad steppe like burnt moths. They dared not come within range of our 20 mm aircraft gun. In a few seconds, Bremer was standing beside me. I pointed to the enemy artillery moving into position and the forward units of our battalion disappearing in a cloud of dust. Words were not needed. What we had learned in long, grueling training in boot camps and on the firing range at that moment fully bore fruit. Wide spread out, the company rushed at the firing guns. From the flanks, the company stormed the Russian artillery positions like a pack of wolves, silencing 4 122mm and 276 mm guns. SS Obersturmführer Hess and Wolf were severely wounded in the melee. Many Red Army soldiers were shaving westward with their hands in the air. Everywhere the eye could see Soviet troops in disorderly flight. Bremer raged like a hound off the leash, leading his company into the thick of the pandemonium. Again, Guderian's words would justify. The machine is a weapon. Our lightning speed literally demoralized the Soviet troops. I led the forward company and swept with my motorcycle messengers through the ranks of the Soviet troops. The main forces of the battalion followed behind at 5-minute intervals. In front of us was a collective farm. Orchards and tall deciduous trees surrounded the peasant houses. As we approached this small group of houses, I began to hesitate. I saw no movement. There were no Soviet soldiers or civilians in sight. Somehow I continued to doubt, even though the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion had just passed through the village. Dust still hung in the air. What could be expected? Peter kept his foot on the pedal and didn't bother about my doubts. But after we passed the first house, I shout. Step on the gas. Drive away. The houses to the left and right were full of Russians. In the farmyard, I noticed a Russian radio station with the antenna still up. Apparently, we had driven right through the Russian command post, the destruction of which the 2nd Company, 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, wanted to leave for the rest of the battalion. Following my orders, the 2nd Company of the 1st SE Reconnaissance Battalion roared through the collective farm without stopping. Remembering the bitter experience of the incident on the highway north, I tried to catch up with the vanguard company at top speed. The main forces of the battalion would have no problem smoking out the Russian headquarters. We breathed a sigh of relief when our armoured vehicle drove into the open steppe, which, it should be noted, was uneven. To our right, the Russian retreat continued in a southeasterly direction. Behind us and somewhat to the right was heard the noise of fighting being waged by Bremer's company. The forward company was still nowhere to be seen. The new company commander had indeed quickly adapted to our style of fighting. The motorcyclists were apparently intoxicated with speed. In a small lowland was the village of Inrievka. It stretched along the road. This village seemed to have died out as well. At the fork of the road we found a 20 mm anti-aircraft gun that had minor mechanical damage. Soon it was on the move again. The artillery commander wanted to take the road east, even though the true road was actually south. It was not without difficulty that I managed to direct the artillerymen on the correct road. The artillerymen were still trying to tell me something and kept pointing east. Angry at the delay, I gestured for them to go where they were told to go. South and at full speed. The artillery commander shrugged in agreement and followed my car. The road ran parallel to the forest belt, which was probably no more than 5 meters wide and consisted of bushes and individual trees. The monotony of the landscape was brightened up by small ascents. In the lowlands, we came across a group of armed Soviet soldiers who were marching southward, and seeing us, stopped as if they had stopped on the spot. I angrily gestured to the Soviet soldiers to drop their weapons on the ground and move north. At the same time, I began to express my displeasure to my adjutant, because the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion had not even disarmed these Russians. Barely had we left the low ground when I noticed other Russians walking briskly away to the south and taking their rifles with them. Some of the officers were still carrying their clipboards. Here I completely lost patience and berated the commander of the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion. Of course, we had to move quickly, but not at the expense of not disarming the prisoners. The last section of the company had to be given this very task. In front of us and to our right we could see thousands of Soviet infantrymen and enemy artillery batteries rushing down the slopes and ridges away. We had cut into the stream of fleeing Russians for about 30 kilometers. Soon it would be time for the battalion to get close to the village of Novospasovka and perhaps risk an assault. The masses of retreating Soviet troops would have to huddle in front of this village. There we could reap the fruits of our operation. Hermann Weiser, my faithful adjutant, nodded in agreement when I informed him of my decision. A few 100 meters ahead of us was the kolkhoz Romanovka. The windbreak ended, and the terrain here was rising slightly. Instead of the strip, a small river flowed southward, forming a small swamp just before the collective farm. I could not see the left side of the village. I could only see a row of houses on the right, stretching from north to south. The village street was at least 20 meters wide. To the west of the collective farm, along a ridge of mounds, the Soviet troops continued to flee. I had never before seen such a mass flight. Another 50 meters, and we reached the first houses of Romanovka. Meanwhile, the hands of the clock were already approaching 14.45, and the sun was burning mercilessly. A stormy atmosphere hung over the countryside and over the panic-stricken masses of people fleeing from us. On the long village street, the hot air fluctuated between the houses. As in other villages, there was no sign of life. Those who were fleeing were avoiding the village. Weiser's shrill cry hit me like a whip. Peter stopped. A shadow flashed from behind the wall to our left. I saw Weiser fire his pistol at the corner of the wall, with his other hand throwing a grenade at the same spot. Damn it, I noticed a Russian anti-tank gun in a firing position and a row of Red Army men lying down in the corner. I jumped to the right, hopped across the street, flew into a dung heap and suddenly saw the terror in the eyes of 2 Russians lying down at their machine gun. Obviously, they had just woken up. We lay opposite each other and waited to see who would make the first move. I did not dare to look at the road. A direct hit had scattered apart our 20 mm anti-aircraft gun crew. The screams of the soldiers turned into howls. Peter called out to me and searched for me with his eyes. He must have been behind me and slightly to the left. On the other side of the road came the clanking of tank tracks. A second shell had hit our anti-aircraft gun. I had to act fast if I wanted to leave this dung heap alive. The 2 Russians were still staring at me stunned. They must have thought that we had attacked the village with a large force and their last hour had come. When I gestured for them to get out, they scurried away like a couple of rabbits. Almost simultaneously with 2 Red Army men, and in one leap I sprinted past our broken anti-aircraft installation and pressed onto a small slope where I found Messenger Drescher and Peter. Weiser had disappeared. Drescher claimed that Weiser had jumped into the house on the left. Only then did it become clear to me why we had run into armed Russians along the way. The advance company at Inrievka had taken the wrong direction, and I had immediately overtaken it, getting into a delicate situation. I could not wait for the main forces of the battalion to appear. I longed for the appearance of SS Sturmführer Fendt with his 88 mm gun. I almost opened fire on Hermann Weiser. How did he manage to get on the roof? He kept pointing excitedly to the left. Did he want to draw our attention to the tank? We were extremely lucky that the slope protected us from a possible Russian tank. I advanced a little higher up the slope until I spotted a small airplane on the outskirts of the village. This jalopy was taking off from the collective farm airfield. Maybe we had reached the headquarters again? The minutes stretched like hours. On our right, the Russians were still retreating through the mounds. We pressed tighter to the ground. The tank changed position. The sound of its tracks came closer and then moved away again. Suddenly, a staff car jumped out of the first collective farm yard at full speed and made such a sharp turn that it balanced on two wheels for some time. At first we were numb with surprise, but then we opened fire on the car with all kinds of weapons. However, it got away, leaving a huge cloud of dust. Finally, we heard the sound of engines and the clanking of tracks behind us. A section of 88 mm anti-aircraft guns was approaching. Our position and the broken 20 mm anti-aircraft gun for the Grenadiers was sufficient guidance for action. With a deft turn, the driver turned the tractor so that the gun was immediately in position to fire. A few seconds later, the explosions of fragmentation shells rumbled along the road. Hauptsturmführer SS Fendt tried to destroy the plane on the airfield, but it was not as easy to do as it seemed. The staff car drove up to the airplane, and soon it took off like a tired bird. The airplane made a big circle over the collective farm and disappeared over the horizon. The 88 mm anti-aircraft gun was doing wonders. Our fighting spirit returned to us, and the paralysis of the last half hour passed. How glorious it was that its shells whistled past us. What pleasant music for soldiers who had already enrolled themselves among the dead and buried. However, a heavy Russian tank broke through the gardens behind us. We couldn't hit it because the slope blocked our view. Infantry guns were brought to the firing position. An anti-tank gun also came up and, together with an 88 mm gun, opened fire on the retreating enemy columns. Finally, at my disposal was also a platoon of sappers. With their help, I could advance further into the village. I wanted to know what was going on there. We entered the first house without a fight. An excited Weiser came up and led the sapper team to the entrance of the cellar. In amazement, I saw Soviet commanders crawling out of the dark dungeon. It led me to the building and reported. Suddenly, on our left, I noticed a Russian tank. Its crew was having breakfast. Before I even had time to let you know of my discovery, an anti-tank gun was against us. I didn't know what to do. Jump! I opened fire on the crew and threw a grenade at them. I didn't know what had become of the Russians. I just wanted to get my feet somewhere safe as soon as possible. I swung open the door of the house and found myself in front of several high-ranking Soviet commanders who were discussing the situation, huddled around a map spread out on a table. My appearance had the startling effect of causing the Red commanders to jump out the window headfirst. Horrific. I jumped up the ladder to the attic, and behind the dung heap I saw you. On the opposite side of the house, many Soviet soldiers and officers were fleeing. A few higher officers climbed onto a tank and drove off. We definitely captured the command headquarters. Before inspecting the trophies, I gave a reprimand to the commander of the 2nd Company, 1st S Reconnaissance Battalion, who had appeared by then. His guilty expression saved him from a thorough beating, and he was eager to carry out his new assignments. His joyful cry prompted me to enter the house. Peter had already put on a Russian general's uniform. On the table were numerous maps, and in the next room was a radio station. We broke into the headquarters of the Russian 9th Army. But unfortunately, The commander escaped on an airplane with the general of the Air Force, and before that, on a staff car which we shelled. Among the captives were several staff officers and the Secretary of the Air Force General. They all behaved in a correct and dignified manner, and only at the interrogation we learned that before this, the headquarters of the 30th Rifle Division of the Russians had been captured in a collective farm. The Ninth Army was retreating, gripped by panic, in the direction of Rostov. Being proud of this extraordinary success, I sent the appropriate report to the division and was thunderstruck when the radio operator gave me a reply from the division. "What is this other boast?" A bucket of ice water would not have had such an overwhelming effect. Having calmed down somewhat, I sent the captured staff officer and secretary to the division. Soon my radio operators began to broadcast orders in Russian. We wanted to deceive the retreating Russians and force them to go on the defensive, thereby giving Mackenzon's motorized corps a chance to slam the lid on the cauldron. But the Soviet troops were unstoppable. Their haphazard retreat continued. Lemmer's company begged for support. During the pursuit, it got involved in fighting. We had to wait for the next day's advance and the infantry following us. For the first time, we failed to make an inventory of the spoils. Everywhere around us were abandoned guns, tractors, and horse harness. Numerous prisoners were striding westward, and many Russians had been killed. We lost 3 men killed, 27 wounded, and 1 soldier missing, just before Darkwit's battalion arrived and completed the combing of the village. Bremer returned to the battalion by midnight. With the 1st Battalion of the 1st SS Motorized Infantry Regiment in our rearguard, we continued the offensive on October 7 with the order to take the port city of Berdyansk. We passed the outposts in the cold fall fog. The 1st Company of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion was ahead. We met padded and abandoned Russian guns, armoured vehicles and tanks. At Berdyansk we encountered a minor enemy force which was retreating as fast as it could to the east. In the main street of Berdyansk we found many Russian civilians shot. Some victims with severe bullet wounds were crawling toward us, begging us to help them. Unfortunately, I never found out why the Soviets massacred the civilians. The Kolkhoz in Androvka was taken after a short but intense battle, and we continued our pursuit at full speed. Strong enemy artillery columns were retreating through the low hills in front of us and to our right. They were overtaken and overrun by us so quickly that the Soviet artillerymen did not even have time to bring their guns into a fighting position. By 10-0, we could no longer count our prisoners and trophies. The day was an exact copy of the previous day, and we could not pick up the pace. Then we were moving through hilly terrain. A few kilometers ahead was the small Burda River, which flowed south, emptying into the Sea of Azov near Berdyansk. If the Soviets were going to make a planned withdrawal, they should have held the west bank of this river and engaged our forces here, delaying our advance so that the retreating troops could be directed to organize defenses on the Mayas River frontier or even all the way to the Don. The Russians had to fight for time and space, and we should not allow them to do so. Their units and formations, pressed by us, had to be destroyed before they gained a foothold. The mobility of German units and formations had to ensure their victory. The Germans could no longer be allowed to drag themselves into long, protracted fighting. At the same time, if you calculate our losses, it turns out that the combat effectiveness of our troops was already below the critical level. None of the units was not fully staffed, and each of them could deploy only remnants of the former combat power. Even the most recent soldier knew that we had to use the crossing near the village of Novospasovka, rushing through it at full speed, and, most importantly, to prevent the bridge from being blown up. Once again, everything was decided by minutes. The vanguard platoon of the 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion rounded a low hill, and he had a view down to the village of Novospasovka. The village is located in a lowland. The riverbed had eroded the banks, which were almost steep. A modern concrete bridge had been thrown over the river. Horses crossed the river in the ford and with difficulty climbed to the opposite bank. The whole lowland was a swelling mass of retreating men, wagons, and equipment, but to our right along the heights, The defeated Soviet units were retreating in an easterly direction and further along the bridge, or were trying to ford the river to ease the strain on the bridge. It was assumed that the 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion would take the bridge in a surprise attack, taking advantage of the enemy's confusion. From the middle of our column, motorcyclists, armoured cars and tank fighters in a broad front roared down the smooth slope into the very middle of the Russian troops. The fleeing Soviet troops had no thought of resistance. In wild panic, they rushed down the slope into the very bed of the river. Horse-drawn artillery, army supply vehicles and infantrymen formed a chaotic throng. Horses stood in the water, unable to climb the opposite bank. More and more people were crossing the river to avoid capture, but they were running towards their deaths. Shells and bullets flew out of countless barrels, sowing death among the fleeing masses. Controlling the retreating troops was no longer possible. People were fleeing in panic to save their lives. The 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion burst into this chaos and, firing all barrels, rushed to the bridge. Several armoured vehicles cleared the bridge with fire from the heights. Only the dead and dying were left lying on it. Suddenly I saw the 1st platoon rush forward, as if bitten by a tarantula. He jumped through the barrier, jumped off their still-moving vehicles, and eliminated the calculation of the Russian heavy anti-tank gun. This cannon was already taking up a firing position. A few seconds more, and the crossing would have been a bloodbath for us. With fire support from the 2nd Company, 1st Reconnaissance Battalion and armoured vehicles on the hill, the 1st Company, 1st SA Reconnaissance Battalion attacked at speed and was soon on the eastern edge of the village. I moved forward with the company along the main street of the village and struggled with my doubts. To continue or not to continue the offensive on Mariupol. In view of the rapid Russian retreat, the situation demanded that we move on to Mariupol in an attempt to push the large Russian forces to the coast of the Sea of Azov. The retreat was in the southeastern direction, that is, towards Mariupol. Why should we then waste precious time in capturing Berdyansk? The city would inevitably fall when Mariupol, located further east, fell. I stood with a few soldiers, deep in the study of the map. We were behind the last houses, intending to go beyond the windswept forest belt that prevented us from seeing the terrain ahead. Franz Roth, the war correspondent, was with us when he suddenly shrieked like a stung man. He pushed me over the strip, and not particularly politely. Franz couldn't get a word out and was literally out of breath. He wanted to start filming everything that was happening with his movie camera. No more than 20 paces ahead was a monstrous Russian tank that seemed to be about to move or open fire at any second. The street emptied in the blink of an eye. SS Untersturmbannführer Bergmann grabbed explosives and snuck under fire cover through a small orchard to detonate the tank. We, holding our breath, followed on the heels of this man. The tank did not move. Its engine was silent. Could it be that this monster had a mechanical problem? Bergman prepared to dash, took a deep breath and rushed toward the tank. At any moment the explosives could fly at the stern of the vehicle, the next second disabling the engine. It was going to happen any second. The shot broke the silence. I saw Bergman fall and the explosives hit the sand a few meters away from the tank. The pistol shot from the tank was fatal to our comrade. There was an explosion, but the Russian tank remained unharmed. After that, the assault gun came into position and sent shell after shell into the steel giant from a distance of no more than 25 meters. Nothing happened. The shells did not penetrate the armor. The Russians seemed invulnerable. The commander of the Isaac gun shook his head doomedly and cursed floridly. His gun had found a worthy opponent. Previously, we had managed to destroy the first T-34s, which we'd already had the pleasure to get acquainted with, mainly with the help of incendiary mixtures from backpack, flamethrowers, or 88M anti-aircraft guns. During the engagement with the T-34s, I was standing in the garden of a small house with some soldiers and climbed up on a small elevation to have a better view. The elevation was apparently a cellar for storing potatoes. We stood for some time on the elevation when suddenly my faithful dog, Pat, rushed furiously into the hole. The dog discovered more than a dozen Russians in the cellar. We looked at each other in confusion, and then the Russians came out of their cache with hand grenades, automatic rifles, and other weapons. We were once again convinced that a soldier in war needs a lot of luck to stay alive.